All right. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's author talk with Eric Fisher as he discusses his new book, Mighty Storms of New England, the hurricanes, tornadoes, blizzards, and the floods that shaped the region. Eric Fisher is Chief Meteorologist for CBS Boston's WBZ-TV News and anchors weather segments weeknights at 5, 6, and 11, as well as WBZ-TV News at 10 on TV 38. He is also a contributor for CBS News, often found reporting on breaking severe weather across the country. Born and raised in New England, Eric says there are few places on earth that produce weather like this little corner of the US. It offers the challenges of blockbuster snowstorms, hurricanes, tornadoes, heat waves, frigid cold snaps, and dramatic seasonal shifts. So please welcome Eric. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We know you've been incredibly busy with the weather over these past few days. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks so much for the introduction there. It's been a busy stretch, as it so often is during the month of February for us here across New England. And well, we'll see how much gets stirred up over the next few weeks. We've got an interesting storm at the end, and for all of those of you who are watching, who are wondering how long that snow will last in the front yard, I think we're going to lose a pretty fair amount of it over the next 36 hours down there on the Cape. But maybe it got you thinking about that big 2015 winter. It's been a few years since we had a storm cold enough to produce some big snow amounts on Cape Cod and the islands in a more widespread fashion. This was definitely kind of in the same mold as some of those storms we had a few years ago. We've had a couple quiet winters ever since then, but maybe we're making up a little bit for lost time here as we make our way through this particular season. So I'm at WBZ this evening, and if you want to get a general idea of how our workday kind of goes, the first thing I do in the morning is I check out the models. Unfortunately, it's not those kind of models, it's computer models. My wife is very understanding, but she knows that that's what I'm looking at when I wake up and see how things went overnight. So it kind of starts the minute you wake up. It's seeing if anything changed during the overnight hours to make sure you're kind of ready to go. Things start going on social media pretty quickly in the morning. You're getting questions. You want to make sure you're informed when you're talking to people, and you want to start the day on the right note. And all day we're kind of watching things kind of trickle in, answering questions, doing social media things. But I'm in the office about 2 to 2:30 until 11:30 to midnight every day. This is a little bit of my downtime. Once we get through some tapings after the 6 o'clock news, usually we have dinner. We might look at some more data, catch up on emails, things like that. And then we're back at it for tapings at 9, and we've got news at 10 and 11. And it's a pretty busy shift overall. And it depends on the week. Wintertime tends to be really busy. If there's storms, it's all bets are off. You work until you're not working anymore. This last Saturday, I came in around 7 in the morning and I left at 1 a.m. So that was a lot of talking. And surprisingly, for a job where your job is to talk for a living, I really don't talk all that much outside of work. So by the end of the day, I did not have much of a voice left over. But I'm from the area, from Western Mass originally. Moved down to Northern Connecticut when I was halfway through middle school. And the only time out of the area that I've spent was a few years down at the Weather Channel. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about my background. I'm going to do a little bit about the book, some of the storms that you might read about in this particular book and how it came about, kind of like a little Cliff Notes version. And then after that, I don't want to put everyone to sleep, so I'll stop talking, and then we'll just do Q&A. And you can lead the discussion, and we'll talk a little bit more about the storms, things that are in the book, questions you might have for a meteorologist in general, and we'll go from there, and we'll let you drive that discussion. To get into a presentation, I'm going to share my screen, so I hope that this works out fairly easily. Let's see here. And we'll go to that presentation, and hopefully you see it now. Should see it now anyway. It's all about mighty storms of New England, and kind of the purpose of this book was to do an overview. It's not deep in depth about any one particular storm. There are great books out there about each one of these types of storms, especially Hurricane of 38, Blizzard of 78, some of the real biggies. You can find some excellent material that looks at all sorts of aspects, human interest stories for any one particular event. This is kind of a gateway book. It's about someone who might be interested in the weather, whether it be casually or you've just noticed it on occasion, or you have a decent background in storms and you just want to learn a little bit more. I tried to pick a little bit of each, from hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, heat waves, fires, blizzards, and coastal storms, because we get pretty much everything here in New England, except for dust storms, at least not yet. And so we basically have a very challenging area as meteorologists to talk about. We have everything under the sun to try to forecast. And just when you're kind of sick of one kind of weather, the season changes and you move on to a different genre. So once I'm kind of tired of big storm systems, the synoptic storm systems, if you will, the blizzards, the rainstorms in the spring, we get into convective season. All of a sudden you're tracking thunderstorms and tornadoes, and it's a whole different way to look at the weather. Some of the background for me, I grew up in that little tiny square that sticks down in Connecticut, Southwick, Massachusetts. And then I moved about 20 minutes south of there when I was halfway through middle school. So always kind of in the same zone. I've always been fascinated by the weather. Some people have a single defining storm. I know for Barry Burbank, who worked here for years, it was Hurricane Carol. For Mish Michaels, who was a meteorologist here for years, it was a tornado in her town in Maryland growing up. For me, it was just a lot of time spent outside. My family had a small farm and orchard in northern Connecticut. And I spent a lot of time there, just being outside, camping and fishing and being outdoors. And when you're outside a lot, you just have a connection to the weather. And I think it kind of grew that way. My mom bought me lots of weather books. I had a little backyard weather station. I was the kid in school who was predicting snow days in middle school and high school for all my classmates. Then I just decided that this was what I was going to do. So I went to SUNY Albany for atmospheric sciences, and I got my degree there. I was very fortunate to work very close to home to start. Usually you end up being sent to Cutbank, Montana, or Bismarck, or somewhere a little bit smaller and out of the picture as you learn how to do television and learn how to forecast. But I was fortunate to start in Springfield. I went to the Weather Channel in Atlanta from there, and now I'm in Boston. And this particular picture is, you might recognize it from Twister, but that's Dorothy, one of the instruments that they have in Twister. The whole plot of the movie is trying to get this up into the tornado, and they have Dorothy down at the Weather Prediction Center in Norman, Oklahoma. I think my experience at the Weather Channel was really important in understanding everyone's type of weather. So you grow up here and you essentially, you have things that you're used to, and every once in a while you get a big event, but the whole idea of the Weather Channel is to always go where there's a big storm or big event happening. And across the entire United States, oftentimes there's something big happening. So my job was to be on the road a lot. Went to a lot of the big tornadoes, all the hurricanes, the floods, the droughts, the fires, and the snowstorms, just out of that home base in Atlanta. And so I got to see what a lot of the country deals with in a really short, condensed amount of time in the few years I was there. Now, as for the book here, the first section that we're going to get into in Mighty Storms is about blizzards, because winter is kind of where the sausage is made. As a New England meteorologist, it's the highest impact season, it's the most costly season, it's the most damaging season, it's the most interesting season, really, when it comes to weather around here. That top picture being from our snow blitz, the snow farm there in 2015. That snow farm was in South Boston, didn't melt until July. And then the blizzard of 78 is down below. And that's chapter number 1 in the book, certainly the storm that everyone still talks about. Then I try to look at a few different categories of winter events. So the blizzard of 78 is kind of the gold standard. Then I looked at big runs of snowfall, and there's the snow blitz of 2015, and there's the great snow of 1717. And these are really the two largest events for snow stacking up on top of itself over time. I looked at the Great White Hurricane of 1888 because while 78 was the kind of trademark storm for Eastern Mass and Rhode Island, 1888 is still the hallmark storm for Connecticut and over toward Eastern New York. And so trying to cover some different areas of New England. On that note, I also want to have the 100-hour storm, which is kind of an oddball and has some snow records in New Hampshire in particular. I looked at the April Fool's blizzard in 97 and Snowtober in October as out-of-season events that were very unusual. And then to mix in some ice storms, we talk about 2008 and 1998 as big ones. As I mentioned, 78 is still kind of the gold standard when it comes to these big winter storms in the Boston area. And it was a big winter. There were two really large storms before it. One of the top 10 snowstorms in Boston is the storm before the blizzard of 78, which came just a couple weeks before the blizzard itself in early February. And before that one, there was the storm that collapsed the Civic Center roof in Hartford. Fortunately, did not kill anybody. It was right after a basketball game got played. But you had that storm, you had all that damage, then a huge snowstorm, then the blizzard of 78. So it was quite a winter. Leading up to the impact of this storm, kind of shaky forecast performance. There were some computer models back then. There's a lot of hand analysis and trying to figure things out, but there wasn't a lot of public confidence going into this storm. And it also started a little bit later than expected, which is part of the reason so many people got caught on the roadways. It came in just after people went to school and work, and then it started snowing, and then we were in big trouble. And it had a stall and loop path that produced the devastating flooding. And people asked me, did this recent storm compare to 78? And no, not even a little bit. It was a lot of snowfall, but not as much snow as 78, and nowhere near the kind of coastal impact that 78 had because of that stall and loop and the way it timed out with the tides. Over 2,000 homes were destroyed, including the outermost house, of course, out in the outer Cape there, where Thoreau spent some time. That was destroyed, as was motif number 1 up in Rockport, which is the most photographed spot in the Northeast. And they rebuilt a replica about a year later, and that's what stands there today. As for the oddball winter storms, I wanted to include the 100-hour storm, which is maybe the most interesting one no one's ever heard of. This was the biggest snowstorm on record in Boston until the blizzard of 78. And it produced almost 100 inches of snow on top of Mount Washington. It wasn't a powerful storm, not a ton of wind or coastal issues. It just hung around, and it just kept going. And so you had these monstrous snow totals, all those red areas, over 30 inches of snow. That's a pretty big footprint. Then we looked at some of the long haul blitzes. In Boston, it was just unbelievable. And I know just all across eastern New England, we had 94.4 inches of snow in 30 days. And really the big thing here is we went over a month, about a month and a half without reaching 40. So once we went below 40 degrees, and that was in late January with the first blizzard, we didn't hit 40 again until March. And so this snow just sat and sat and sat. Meanwhile, 1717 was in the Little Ice Age. And the theory goes that it was fueled by some large volcanic eruptions at the time. So it was already a cold time. And there was drifts up to the tops of houses where you just saw chimneys sticking out during that one. Then we can switch gears a little bit. We talk about the major hurricanes. So there's lots of high impact tropical events in New England. But in terms of the major ones, that's what I wanted to touch on, where they're category 3 or higher for the purposes of this book. And the last time we had one was Carol in Edna back in 1954. We have the hurricane of 38, we have the Great September Gale of 1815, and we have the Great Colonial Hurricane of 1635. Now, Carol's the most recent one, and this was during a really busy time for New England hurricane hits. Something that will probably happen again someday, it's just a matter of time, but this was a hyperactive time for us. This picture is pretty incredible, because usually when hurricanes come up here, they're getting kind of ugly. They don't have that classic look that you see down on the Gulf Coast. They're starting to change into extratropical cyclones. But this was the eye of Carol, near the old Griswold Inn in Connecticut. So very atypical to see this clearing in the blue sky in a New England hurricane. Had 135 mile per hour gust on Block Island. And amazingly, Edna hit the Cape and the islands as a major hurricane 12 days later. So less than 2 weeks later, you had back-to-back major hurricanes. This is very, very unusual in the record books of New England. Just imagine what we'd be talking about nowadays with 2 of them in that short amount of time. 38 captures a lot of imagination, because this was such an unusual storm. It took this left hook. And so instead of slicing across the area that most hurricanes do, it drove itself inland into the west. And that put all the strongest winds and the biggest storm surge right squarely across New England. There's a storm with no warning whatsoever. I mean, people had not a clue. They left for work that one of the worst storms in the history of New England was going to hit a couple hours later, which is hard to fathom nowadays. And a reason that it really took people by surprise, it was moving at 45 to 50 miles per hour when it got here. And that's a common theme with major New England hurricanes. They're all moving fast. You can't have a storm over our cooler water for long. Otherwise, it loses its intensity. So all these are quick moving hurricanes. Over 2,000 boats were destroyed, 700 people killed. There's a dirty little secret about the Blue Hill Observatory wind record, that 186 mile per hour gust was not actually recorded. People always ask about, how can we not get these wind gusts recorded now? We lose power, and we had this gust back in the past. We didn't. This is based on an estimate of peak wind speeds before the equipment was destroyed, and also using a technique to look at how fast clouds are moving by to kind of get the idea of how quickly the wind is going in the atmosphere. So it's an estimate of that, but it seems pretty legit based on the winds that were experienced. 5% of all the forests in New England came down this storm. To wrap your head around that, that's the equivalent of the entire White Mountain National Forest going down in a few hours. So it was an incredible loss of trees. and it crashed the lumber industry for a while. They had to have a whole federal work program put in place to see what they could do with all this lumber and get it to market, but it was really disastrous at the time. And then the 1635 colonial hurricane is fascinating because it's reconstructed essentially using diaries. People were very observant at the time. So our colony governors, William Bradford, John Winthrop at the time, were talking about the wind direction, and you can kind of piece together where the center of the circulation was. And then Brown University looked at some sediment data in Rhode Island. So they basically do a core like they do ice cores in the Arctic, and they can look at where there's big pushes of sediment that get driven ashore, and you can figure out the storm surge. And from the storm surge, you can figure out the pressure and how strong the storm was. So there's ways to piece together really old things, even though we didn't have the same technology that we have now. This is also where Thatcher Island was born. Anthony Thatcher and his family were on a ship during this hurricane, and it crashed. And the only people that survived were him and his wife. And they shipwrecked on what is now Thatcher Island. The state gave them the property and the name, and that name is still there today with the twin lighthouses that are off of Cape Ann. The other thing that we go into are major flood events. We talk about Irene and the 1927 floods in Vermont. We've got the Connie and Diane floods in '55, which were really, I think, some of the worst we've ever seen in southern New England. And the 36 Connecticut River flood has a big one as well. Connie and Diane are great examples of you don't need a powerful hurricane or even a landfall to have big tropical impacts. Neither of these made landfall in New England. Neither of them were hurricanes. And yet we had this huge rainfall from Connie, which was mostly kind of a south to north orientation. You can see that heavier rainfalls in Western Connecticut, Western Mass, and into Vermont. And then Diane paralleled the coast and produced a big east to west axis of rain. And when you put them together, you had over 25 inches of rain in Westfield and in Barkhampton, Connecticut. So you get to Western Mass and Connecticut, and you've got over half a year's worth of rain in a week. And this still holds a 24-hour rainfall record at Windsor Locks with over a foot in 24 hours. And all this water led to catastrophic flooding, especially into the hills of Western Connecticut, Torrington, Winsted area. They saw just catastrophic damage. And some of those towns really took years and years to come back. Then we go to Irene, which is, again, an example of how you don't need a powerful hurricane to produce some of the worst damage you'll ever see from tropical weather in New England. Almost every single town in Vermont reported damage out of this. Thousands of homes and businesses were lost. A lot of covered bridges were taken out. A lot of them initially were taken out by that 1927 flood, over 1,000 of them. But this one took out some notables as well. And it also shows that you don't need a ton of rainfall when you have complex terrain to have a big flood. It had already been a wet summer, and in 27, it was a wet fall. And Irene only brought about 5 to 8 inches of rain in a lot of spots, which in Florida, it just soaks into the sand and it's no big deal. In Vermont, with all that velocity and out into the Berkshires and the Catskills, it causes widespread major damage, which is what we certainly saw back there a little over 10 years ago. Another topic that we get into, tornadoes could have been a much longer chapter. I tried to just pick a couple of the most notable here. There's a lot of other ones that certainly are worthy of entry here, but just to touch on the biggies, I picked the deadliest one and also the costliest one. So we have the Worcester Tornado as the deadliest, and we have the Windsor Locks Tornado as the costliest. It was a direct hit on the airport and the Air Museum, which really racked up a big bill there. And it shows that tornadoes can happen very much out of season. The Windsor Locks Tornado was powerful, but it was on a cool day in October. So it was a bit of an unusual one. The Worcester Tornado was more classic. So the Worcester Tornado had a lot of firsts. This was the first time a severe thunderstorm warning was ever issued anywhere in the country. This killed nearly 100 people, which is one of the deadliest tornadoes in U.S. history. I think that's always striking to think about, that one of the deadliest in U.S. history was in Massachusetts, not somewhere in the South or the Midwest. It was right here at home. This was a hot day, summer day. It had all the classic ingredients of major severe weather. And it's just fascinating to think that they hemmed and hawed, and they didn't want to say the word tornado, even though they thought, which, today, of course, you'd have days of talk about tornado potential, but they thought it would create panic. It just wasn't a time yet where you would discuss these things. But this was an F4 tornado on the cusp of F5. Debris fell all the way to outer Cape Cod. And there were a couple of other F3 tornadoes that day from Sutton to Mansfield and then Exeter, New Hampshire. So this was a very active severe weather day in June of '53. And one of the first tornadoes ever caught on radar. This is an experimental radar out of MIT, and it did catch a Hook echo. It looks a little different than our radar today, but this was kind of the first start of tracking severe weather. And in Windsor Locks in 1979, this was, you might notice us talk on the in the summertime. We're doing forecasts talking about warm fronts and watching warm fronts or triple points. Basically areas where there's a little bit of extra wind shear in the atmosphere and just enough instability. This was one of those types of setups. This was also an F4. It was a day that started with cool, drizzly weather, and then a warm front came right up the Connecticut River Valley, and that's exactly where that tornado anchored to. This was one of the 10 costliest on record up until recent years, until 2013. It would be estimated at about $1 billion in damage in today's money. In terms of summer hazards, I want to talk a little bit about summer heat and fires. There's a couple of years that stand out. Interestingly enough, the deadliest natural disaster in New England history was a heat wave in 1911. There's estimates of over 2,000 people killed by this. It's an era before much ice even, freezers, certainly air conditioning. There was no way to really cool off the body. Concord reached 100 degrees 4 times over the course of a week and a half. And that record high of 104 still stands in Boston. It's only been tied once. So this was an incredible run of heat in the early 1900s. And then there's 1947, the year that Maine burned. And this shows and talks about a lot of scenes that you now picture out west. Some of the things that they go through in, say, California or Montana or Oregon or Washington. This was a similar situation in Maine out of this one. It was an unusually hot and dry autumn. There's a number of days in the 80s in Maine in October, which certainly does not happen often. Still some record holders from this particular wave. And parts of Maine went over 3 months without any rainfall at all. So it was a tinderbox. And then the winds really picked up in mid-October, and this started the fires. They had a Dunkirk of Bar Harbor, they called it, to get people out of the town as the fire started around what is now Acadia and then spread down to the town that burned down a bunch of mansions there that were never really rebuilt the same way. People evacuated by boat to try to get away from all the flames there. And then there was a huge fire in southern York County that burned right through places like Kennebunkport. It just missed the downtown, sweet little downtown commercial district, mostly north of that, but it burned right to the ocean. And so everything that is rebuilt now is after that fire that came through. And then we talk about coastal storms. These often happen in the cold season, big marine hazards, a lot of destruction along the coastline. Cape Cod is certainly familiar with any coastal storms around here, and they can change the face of our beaches, but they don't really fall into a necessarily blizzard category. I wanted to give them their own little section here. The perfect storm is certainly in here, and the no-name hurricane that came with it. Unfortunately, very famous for the movie The Perfect Storm that resulted from the tragedy of the Andrea Gale, with 6 aboard and no survivors from that. And Sebastian Junger has actually written an excellent book about their plight in particular, which I would definitely recommend if you haven't read it yet. They had a wave height of 100 feet recorded south of Nova Scotia with this storm, and it involved some tropical funny business. So it was an extratropical cyclone, like a nor'easter, that absorbed Hurricane Grace that was off to its east, a smaller hurricane, maybe gave it a little bit of extra oomph. And then as it was pulling away, another little baby hurricane formed right in the center where warm air had collected in the middle of the cyclone. It became the no-name hurricane because the Weather Service didn't really want to name it to add to public confusion at the time. It wasn't coming back toward land. They didn't want people to think, oh, we just had this storm and now a hurricane's coming. They never really gave it a name. But interestingly enough, we had Henri this year, and this little hurricane would have been named Henri. It was the same list. There was severe erosion in this storm. Perfect Storm is interesting because it was pretty much entirely a coastal event. For inland people, it was just a breezy, rainy storm. But all the impact was right at the coast, and it was a tremendous impact. Then we go into the Portland Gale in 1898, which was named after the steamship SS Portland. It sank during the storm. There are no survivors. 150 other ships were also destroyed in this storm. And it was a major early season snowstorm. You think about the coastal impact, but this is still the biggest snowstorm on record for so early in a season for New York and Boston and Worcester. So we had a lot of snowfall in November out of this particular storm, and they didn't find and exactly locate the spot where the Portland went down until 2002. So pretty recent development. So that's kind of an overview of some of the storms we talk about in the book. And some takeaways for me after researching in depth some of these systems. I thought it was really fascinating that major events lead to some big societal and technological change. That was my number one takeaway for all these events. Someone basically looked around and said, you know what, something's got to change because we're doing things incorrectly. The Worcester tornado brought about the birth of the Storm Prediction Center, which is a more centralized place to forecast severe weather, and the radar rollout across the country took place right after. In 1947, we had a new agency that was created to coordinate monitoring and fighting wildfires, which still exist today. Big floods like 36 led to big projects for the Army Corps of Engineers to build dams, flood controls, so we don't see water levels for the most part from what we saw back in those huge floods in the 30s, both from 36 and the hurricane of 38 was right up there in terms of flooding. Hurricane Carol led to the creation of the National Hurricane Center. It was a very high impact hurricane season. There was also Hazel back in 1954. So they got a centralized hurricane forecasting or tropical weather forecasting center. And then the 1888 blizzard, people said, it's an absolute mess. We can't get around. So they started the creation of the subway systems in New York and in Boston. Of course, Boston won because we always win. And we had our subway system up and running. And then after listening to some of these big storms, you might wonder, how will climate change affect the future? We certainly know there's much less severe cold around compared to what there was in the past. What will we see here in New England? To me, I think water is our biggest issue going forward, both from sea level rise and increasing frequency of heavy precipitation, both in rain and snow. It really stresses out infrastructure. And for all of us near the coastline, we're always watching those water levels, and we've seen a big increase in sunny day flooding in places like Boston and down in Virginia and parts of New Jersey, Miami, all these places that are now seeing just more water inundation over time. In terms of other extremes, there's lower confidence on severe storms and tropical cyclones. What exactly will the relationship be, and what will we see going forward? It's not as high confidence as things like temperatures, sea level rise, and precipitation changes. And so with that, I don't want to put everyone to sleep, talk too long, and lose some attention span here. So I just want to share a little bit of a look at what we talk about in the book here. I'm always open to more storm stories and hearing what people have to say about weather in their area. All these storms are very local. And so I hope that you've taken away a little bit of an interesting look at some of what we discuss here, but I also want you to drive the conversation. I think it's always much more interesting that way. So I will stop with the presentation, and we'll set up the camera, and we can just have a talk here for the rest of our time.
Thank you so much. And I also want to mention that you can get Eric's book, Mighty Storm of New England, at the library. You can check it out from the library, and you can also purchase them at Eight Cousins on Main Street. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. And if you would also like to, you can also raise your hand and we'll go through. So we do have some questions coming in. Weather forecasting has become much more accurate in recent years. What are some of the unknowns that still cause uncertainty with today's forecasting?
Oh, uncertainty. I love uncertainty. That is the name of the game. There's still plenty of that nature has to offer. So it's always uncertain. A question I get a lot when I post, a forecast or some information on Twitter or something like that is, could it change? Yes, always. It can always change. You're trying to predict a chaotic atmosphere. And, in a way, as forecasts have gotten better over time, I think we've also boxed ourselves in. It hasn't gotten easier because now we're trying to get more precision. So something that you might have noticed where we had the last snowstorm is my forecast, I try to hit banding. Instead of just in the old days, you just go 12 to 24. And that would basically be it. There'd be a one blob over the area, and you just say, gonna snow a lot tomorrow, and you leave it at that. Now, I think, we're trying to hit smaller ranges and smaller areas. So in that storm, I was trying to find that banding that would be near the coast and in southeastern Mass. That worked out great. And then I was trying to find where that other band would be in central Mass. We did see one flare up. It didn't quite get going fast enough to get to some of the totals in a lot of areas that I was expecting in that band zone into Worcester County. But from northeastern Connecticut up into Worcester County, lo and behold, that band was there. And then you had the subsidence or the lower totals on either side, which was also a part of our forecast. So as we kind of get more technology and we try to fine tune our forecast, we're also trying to hit smaller targets to be more precise. So there's always uncertainty. And as we try to shrink that envelope, you're just going to have more uncertainty. So we're getting there. I think it's definitely better. But if you're looking for perfection, going on the news and doing the weather is not reading off facts for everyone. It's giving an opinion of what the atmosphere is going to do, and everyone's going to have a slightly different opinion.
Thanks, Eric. How come Bob did not make your book?
Bob, definitely, it's up there in terms of New England tropical systems. It didn't make it because it wasn't a major hurricane. When we say major, it's not just, major in our minds or major in its general impact. It's category 3 or higher. So I wanted the book to be mostly an overview of some of the biggest outlier storms. Bob was not up to that strength of some of the other ones, but there's always room for more volumes. This is not a comprehensive, you could have added 250 more weather events that are fascinating or high impact across the area. This is kind of a good starting point of some of the biggest. And so I went with the biggest hurricanes for this particular one.
Since it is so recent, how do you compare this past weekend storm against some of the more mighty storms of the past?
Yeah, to me, I think the big difference maker when it comes to snowstorms and coastal storms is how they time with tides. Because if you don't have that aspect of high impact coastal weather, then it doesn't make its way to the top of the list compared to some of the more infamous ones. And it's really just a difference of hours or the lunar cycle when it comes to timing out with the tide or where exactly we are in terms of that tide cycle with the moon. So this storm had a lot of snow for sure. It's up there with some of the big snowfall events that we've had. But in terms of impact, there wasn't a lot. I mean, we had some power outages on Cape Cod in particular, so a higher impact there compared to many spots, but coastal flooding was minor. We had certainly some erosion, but we didn't have major damage that we've seen in previous coastal storms. So to me, it wouldn't make the cut compared to some of these other more higher end systems, but a lot of snowfall for sure. And there's a good amount of snowstorms that have produced 2 feet or more in the area that don't quite get there because of that timing. But I think the most infamous ones, they line up with the tides, and that's how you end up remembering them.
This next one is actually a comment from Carl, who remembers picking up Worcester mail in Quincy from the tornado.
Yes, it's incredible how far that these tornadoes will pick things up and just deposit them somewhere else. We saw in Kentucky where some people in Ohio were finding mail from those Kentucky tornadoes a couple months ago. They actually found a frozen mattress in the bay around Quincy after the Worcester tornado. So something that picked up, brought into the atmosphere high enough to freeze, and then fell back to the ground. So it's really breathtaking, the power of these. And that was my takeaway at the Weather Channel. I had never seen big tornadoes until I worked there. And seeing what they do to pretty sound structures or strong building materials, it was very eye-opening.
Our next question is, why are some lightning bolts really loud and not just because they're close?
That's a great question. So thunder can sound different depending on different atmospheric conditions. So thunder follows lightning always. Lightning heats up the air and thunder's a sound wave essentially. So when it's really loud and not necessarily right next to you, it's usually when there's a temperature inversion in place. So sometimes it's these colder thunderstorms where you might hear really loud thunder. A temperature inversion is kind of it's when temperatures are doing things backwards. As you go up, instead of cooling off, they're getting warmer. And you can think of that warmer air as kind of a ceiling or a lid on the lower atmosphere. So when that thunder starts to roll, it's basically bouncing off of that lid. It's like a density change. And so you get this louder sounding, rolling, booming thunder, which is always a bit of a shock to the system out there. But that's usually the explanation as to why it sounds louder at some times than others.
How much do your gut feelings go into your forecasts?
A lot. You've got your models and you've got your data, but in terms of, gut could also be just called time. How long have you been doing it? How many times have you seen the same setups? So I think all of us grow as forecasters over time as you see more storms and there's just more in your memory bank. It's kind of like machine learning, but much slower because we're human. But you start to learn what models are good at certain things, what they tend to fail at, how patterns tend to go. Even if the model's showing you one thing, you say, I've been here before. That's not how this is going to work. You get into that pattern recognition. So over time as a forecaster, hopefully you're getting better and you kind of look at these things and you might take a more nuanced view than just the model saying this, so I'm going to say this.
Kind of ties into the next question. In day-to-day forecasting, what are the best predictors? Radar, barometer, humidity? What are your thoughts on that?
So if you weren't using computers, if you weren't using computer modeling, barometer is always a very good indication of whether the weather is going to be getting better or worse for you. If you're going to be looking at fair skies or stormy conditions, just watching nature, whether or not animals are roosting, if they're packing it in, something might be brewing. I really like the calm before the storm. It's not just a cliche. Many of you probably noticed this before our blizzard. The day before was so still. So the water was slack. There was barely any wind. There's a little sun mixing in with some flurries. And there's a book, Time of Wonder, that I always like. It's about a big storm up in Maine building. And it talks about the change in the bell buoy, going from that really calm feel to that first clanging that's out there in the bay. And it's that turn of the tide before a big storm. I think that's always a really good indicator. And some of the older storms that we talk about in the book, there are a couple people who said, I knew a big storm was coming because it was just so quiet. So that is a telltale sign.
Awesome. And please keep the questions coming in the comments. Our next one is, what is the correlation between seasonal weather trends and climate change?
Seasonal weather trends and climate change. Well, I can tell you kind of from a Northeast perspective, what we've been seeing. So we update, when we say average on the news, the average is a 30-year average. And the 30-year averages are changed every 10 years. So they were just changed last year. It updated. So we lost the 80s and we gained the 2010s, basically. This is to give you a general idea of the most recent climate. This is how growing zones work. This is how you plan your garden for infrastructure purposes, all those sorts of things. And so what we've seen over time is that the fastest warming season is winter, and fall is right behind that. And then there's summer, and spring is the slowest, which I think is something we were all kind of inherently feeling. That spring has been a laggard compared to how we feel about other seasons, where fall, I feel like, has been very noticeable. And winter largely has been very noticeable too. Most of our warmest on record have been the last few years. There's been a couple of big exceptions. We've had a cold stretch here this year for the last several weeks, and we remember 2014 and 15 and 13, 14. So there's a couple of big winters mixed in, but the trend has been certainly in the other direction. So when we talk about seasons, I think that you're looking at the cold seasons that are changing most rapidly here locally. And then it's the spring that's been kind of held back. And why that's happening isn't necessarily clear. If it's something to do with Arctic changes, because there's been less sea ice and a slower ice in across the Arctic in the fall, that certainly could be impacting patterns that are heading down into our latitude and pushing fall a little bit later. And then maybe the springtime thing is nature trying to make up for it. And getting some seasonal lag. There's a climate system that's supposed to be a checks and balances. So maybe that's part of what's going on. I try to study climate as much as I can, so I'm well versed on it. At the end of the day, I'm a meteorologist and not a climatologist, though. It's kind of like having a good general contractor who could probably do a number of things around the house. But if you have a really intricate electrical project, you want to get a really good electrician who has a specialization in that skill. So for climatology questions, find a really good climatologist, and they could help you out even more than I could.
Okay. Eric, do you have a preference when it comes to the various models?
A preference? Well, it depends on what I'm looking for. So you start out, if you're looking at something 2 weeks from now, you're going to use something called ensembles. An ensemble is basically like you take a model, let's say the Euro, And the euro has a patriarch or a matriarch, if you will. And that's the euro that everyone talks about. It's the one run that we use every day. But the ensembles have 50 other members. So it's kind of like that mom or dad has a bunch of family members, kids, cousins, aunts, and uncles, who are all a little bit different. And an ensemble basically takes a look at all those people who are similar because they're in the same family, but looks at their future because they're all a little bit different. They have different outcomes. So it takes that starting points that's all a little bit different than the other, and then you see where they go. And so it gives you a better idea of what's possible in the days ahead. So we start with those for anything broad, and then you get into that 4 to 7 day range, and now you're looking more into those operational GFS Euro models. Which one am I going to use? It depends on the pattern. If the pattern's fast, I'm probably going to use the GFS. It's better at that. If it's more juicy, more amped up, I'm probably going to use the Euro. It's better at that. And then once we get within 48 hours or so, I pretty much abandon those. And then I move to high-res models. High-res models don't run out as long, but they give us the fine details of what we're looking for. In a snowstorm, it's banding, it's a rain snow line, it's what the thermal profile is going to be. A day like Thursday night to Friday, we're looking at those to see how exactly it's going to play out from rain to sleet or ice or snow. So you kind of leave the big boys behind, the Euro, the GFS, all those things. And now you're moving into these smaller scale models that are meant to look at the small details. So it really depends on how many days out you are and what the pattern is.
Okay. I second this next question. It seems like we're having more windstorms each year. Can you explain why this might be so?
It's a question we get every year, and the answer is no, we're not. If you look at winds, they're actually decreasing over time. Average wind speed has been falling in the Boston area slightly. You wouldn't notice a huge change, but they're on the way down. So it's something that people tend to notice in the spring. We get this question every spring. It usually leaves after that, but every spring it'll come back again. There is a climatologist I follow on Twitter. His name's Brian Brett Schneider. He's up in Alaska. And this is one of his hills that he'll die on too. He looks at all the data and he's like, semi-regular reminder, no, it's not windier than it used to be. Taking a look at all the data, it's just not. You could make a case that perhaps singular wind events might be increasing. So while the average wind speed is not, maybe we've had more high-end windstorm events. It's tough to quantify that, but that could certainly be something that is true. I know that I've definitely felt in the fall, in particular, we've had a lot of real banger windstorms as of late. Whether or not that's a trend or something that has just happened a few times the last few years, I guess remains to be seen.
Thank you for the clarification on that. Harriet wrote, she was born in the Worcester tornado that came through Boston. And her question is it going to become more prevalent for tornadoes to stay together for many, many miles in the future?
It's a good question. I don't think we really know. A lot of climate change data on severe weather is not particularly conclusive in any one way. We haven't seen any real significant trends in the Northeast. One thing that I would look for is that as the ocean warms up, it's more likely to have them in coastal areas in cooler climates like ours, because the ocean is a stabilizing factor. And if you add several degrees to the ocean, that takes away some of that stability. It makes it possible for storms to survive in places like Cape Cod and the islands of the South Coast more than they might have in the past. And one note that I would say on tornadoes is that it seems like we're getting a lot more warnings. We are getting a lot more warnings. The reason for that is not necessarily many more tornadoes, but better technology. In the early 2010s, we rolled out a new type of radar called dual pol radar, which really increased our resolution, our ability to scan. We have a system called SAILS now, where you can do scans every 1 to 2 minutes, which gives us a rapid look at tornadoes. And in New England, most of our tornadoes are quick, they're brief, they're hard to find. And so this really changed the way we can look into storms. And we're seeing many more of them, ones that might have been missed in the past. It's also just a lot easier to warn storms that would not have been warned in the past. So we are seeing more warnings for sure, and technology is playing a bit of a role in that.
Okay. The North Atlantic is warming up faster than expected, and the Gulf Stream moving closer to New England. Will this steer more hurricanes toward New England landfall?
It's a good question. In terms of our water, it's certainly warming up. I feel like we've been very fortunate in recent years. I mean, we talked about some of those big hurricanes. It's been 70 years since we had a major hurricane. So it really comes down still to the atmospheric steering currents in any one given year or any one given time, in terms of whether or not we get a hit. Certainly, if the water's warmer, there's a better chance of a hurricane surviving up here or being at a higher intensity when it gets to this latitude compared to what would have been the case 100 years ago. I think it's just a matter of time. This is the thing that keeps us up at night as meteorologists. The one thing we fear the most is the next big hurricane. It's just been so long. There are so many more trees than the last time we had one. There are more people. There's more stuff in the way. The coast is more built up. This is the thing. This is the one defining thing that hasn't happened for a while, that every summer we wait and we say, is this going to be the year?
We have a blizzard of 78 question. WBZ radio said chance of snow at noon. Hold on, we were told to close up and go home. I used the red line, which kicked everyone off at Andrew. It was a very bad walk with horrendous winds. Why was the forecast so badly off for that?
Yeah, I mean, it's the 70s. It's weather is there, but it's not there yet. I mean, there was some good forecasts and some bad ones. I think locally, a couple of meteorologists were right on, and a couple were not. It wasn't a time where you could watch a storm really come together. You're watching the computer models. I mean, imagine not being completely locked in to a storm like the blizzard of 78. We'd start talking about it 10 days out now. But in the 70s, things are more rudimentary. There was one model, the LFM, which is around then. So there was a way to see what was coming in. And it was actually pretty good. The LFM was fairly accurate for that storm. So it did give a good hint of what was to come. Not everyone jumped on it. And so it just goes to show you the kind of the strides that have been made in forecasting. You also look at some of those forecast maps, like I was talking about earlier. It's just like, here's 10 to 25. It's going to snow a lot. There wasn't the ability to really hone in on exact totals. I mean, now we make life so hard for ourselves now. We go into the models and I'm trying to figure out not just where the bands are going to set up, but what type of snowflakes are going to develop. There's all sorts of different snowflakes that can form. Some stack up more efficiently than others. So we're trying to figure out if there's going to be needles, plates, or dendrites. And dendrites are going to stack up really well, and other types might not stack up so well. So there's all this detail, and the way we can watch storms now, the resolution of satellites and radar and computer models. There's still times where weather pulls one over on us, and we get completely busted. That still happens from time to time, but it's much more rare than it used to be.
Dave wants to thank you for your social media engagement. It's been great to be able to make one-on-one connections with meteorologists. How much time do you spend on social media channels, and is it predominantly Twitter?
Way too much. Way too much. Although I agree, it's nice to talk to people. When I've done the book tour, when we popped out to some breweries and whatnot this fall, the number one common thread was, I love your Twitter feed. And hi, I'm Joe from Twitter, or I'm, Ed in Danvers. And, you'd get to meet all these people that you talk to all the time. And then they're in real life. You're like, oh, that's what you're like. Okay, great. Nice to meet you. Most of Twitter is good. Sometimes you're just like, why do I do this? I'm on it a lot. It is my predominant source of information. And sharing information. I don't use Facebook at all. I got rid of Facebook a few years ago. And Instagram is basically like pictures of my wife more than me and like landscapes and occasional food. I don't use it effectively, I guess, is what I'm saying, in terms of sharing weather information. But Twitter is generally what I use the most. And I just feel like over time, I've tried to weed out the bad apples and just keep the good relationships with the people who are really constructive with it. And we try to answer as many questions as we can. I always wonder if it takes away from our viewership, because I do give away a lot of information. I mean, they expect you to post like something a day, but I post a lot of information, free information. But I don't think it does. From what I've heard from people, it's just an additional way to build a relationship, but people will still tune into the news for the news itself and to watch a forecast. But they like to have that side relationship as well.
Do you still need independent snow observations, or do you rely on the National Weather Service?
No, we absolutely need observations. We love them. And the Weather Service also relies on those observations. If you join Skywarn or CocoRoss, which is a collaborative program with rain, hail, sleet, snow, all that sort of thing. If you join one of those and send in reports, they're extremely helpful, especially as they build up over time, because they create an extra record at all these individual sites. Some co-op stations and places that people have maintained to go back decades and decades in any one spot. And so I think they add so much value. I don't know what's going on in your town. I can guess, but I don't know for sure until you tell me. You need that ground truth. So I think it's so important, and it's great that so many people still do it.
Excellent. Diane says she feels like we're seeing more tornadoes than in the past. Is the area more prone to them now?
So I think we answered this question a bit earlier, talking about tornado frequency. I don't know that it's up. It might be up very slightly, if anything, but mostly it's about technology and warning and ability to see tornadoes. And just the fact that, we're a forested area, and a lot of the area is actually, pretty rural still. A lot of these tornadoes are EF0s. They go through the woods. Years ago, never would have gotten surveyed, never would be confirmed. No one would ever see it. Like a farmer would see it 5 days later. But now someone with a cell phone or a smartphone captures a squirrel, tornado, or they see some damage, and there you go. Or we see on a radar a brief tornado debris signature, confirmed. So there's a lot of that going on now.
In a recent news magazine, there was a report of a recorded setting cloud-to-cloud lightning bolt of over 400 miles. How is something like that measured?
I actually don't know. I saw it going around. I have not read the full report. We have a lightning mapper. It's on GO16. It's on one of our satellites where you can monitor lightning. I don't know exactly how they measured it. I should read the full report. So thank you for the homework assignment.
Excellent. Julie would like to know, which one of the old weather adages like red sky at night are accurate, and what do they mean?
So a lot of them are pretty accurate. Red sky morning, sailor take warning. Kind of the reason for that, if you think about it, conceptually, is that the sun rises in the east. If clouds are creeping in from the west and that cloud deck is being lit up as clear sky gives way to increasing clouds, then that's an indicator of changing weather and stormy conditions that are moving in from the west, which is where our weather generally comes from. And red sky at night, sailor take delight. Sun's setting in the west, the clouds are departing to the east, the cloud deck gets lit up to the east, and so you basically have a storm system that's on the way out and clear skies that are on the way in. So that's why that tends to work a good amount of the time. Not every time, but if you think about how that would work, it makes a lot of sense.
Okay. Thank you. We have a few minutes left, so I'm going to keep going through these questions. Is there a scientific or meteorological reason for why you can always smell a rainstorm or snowfall coming?
Well, I agree with that sense of snow, that smell of it. I don't know what it is. Rain, there is an explanation. That thing about snow, I'm not sure about, but rain, you tend to smell it after a dry spell. That's called petrichor. It's basically bacteria that you're snorting. So things build up spores over time. And when it's been very dry for a while, that earthy smell, that's what you're whiffing up when you get a good rain shower in the spring or heading into the summertime. But petrichor, Google that, and it'll tell you a little bit more about that phenomenon. Snow, I don't know, that escapes me, but I agree. There's definitely a thing to it.
That was a really interesting answer, and I want to look that up after this. So I've heard that the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than anywhere else in the world. How do you expect this will affect our weather?
Yeah, so more than 99% of all water bodies, the Gulf of Maine has seen the most significant warming trend over the recent years. How does it affect our weather? Well, certainly I think that what we've seen recently as things warm up in the ocean nearby is that we've seen some pretty heavy precipitation events. and some pretty intense nor'easters to go along with it. The reason that would happen, a couple of reasons. In terms of nor'easters, nor'easters feed off of what we call baroclinic zones. They're areas with sharp temperature gradients or changes over a distance. So if you've got cold Arctic air that's coming down over the actual land and then it meets up with this warmer water, you've got a better gradient, you've got a good feasting area for storms to develop. In terms of heavy precipitation, if you advect in or move in some of that air, if it's more moist, if it has more water content to it, if it's warmer, you can generate some heavier rainfall or snowfall. I feel like all of our storms now, particularly in winter, it comes down to some ridiculous band of snow that's coming down at 3 to 4 inches per hour. And we've got these big, unusual moisture plumes that come along with the storms. And it's increasingly become trying to forecast these bands that are so intense and less about just broad areas of snowfall. You know, the 3 to 6 map or the 4 to 8 map for the area, I can barely count them on, a hand over the last 5 years. It seems like it's all or nothing. It snows or rains like crazy, or it's something that's just kind of middling. So I think that is something that we're watching, and certainly it affects the marine life as lobsters are moving north with changing time, and we're seeing different fish species. I hear from a lot of fishermen around the Cape, and increasingly they're seeing more and more tropical fish varieties heading into August and September and even into early October. So that's the stuff I look for. It's biological markers. It's looking at how nature's changing, because no matter what our graphs tell us or our data tells us, nature's just doing its thing. It can't change the thermostat or put on a sweater or wear a pair of shorts. It's just going to change based on whatever weather is giving it.
What is the cause of a calm before the storm? Is it a pressure change?
It is a pressure change. So usually it's about high pressure that's overhead that's departing. And usually it's a powerful area of high pressure, which usually that's how you get those big gradients whipped up where you've got a ton of wind. If you've got a good strong high overhead, you're going to really calm things down. And then as it moves away and you bring in low pressure, now you've got that big gradient that's going to whip up the storm and whip up the wind.
Excellent. We just have a couple more questions left and our time is almost up. If you are a high school student who wants to become a meteorologist, what educational and professional path would you recommend?
First and foremost, just take a lot of science and math. That's basically what I did. I kind of knew that meteorology was what I wanted to go into, and those are your two big subjects. So whatever your high school offers, these days there's a good long list. I know even when I went to high school, I took oceanography and chemistry and physics and astronomy and freshwater environments and botany, and we had a number of classes, geology also in there. So getting a good background in a lot of environmental sciences is a good way to go. And making sure you're taking calculus, because that will come up in a big way if you're going into meteorology. And looking for internships once you're in college, trying to get some real world experience in a number of different fields. Meteorologists are kind of known for being on TV, but there are way more jobs outside of television than there are in television when it comes to weather. Way more, and increasingly more every year. So there's a lot of things that might be surprising to people, paths you could take with the knowledge of weather or climate or coding and data visualization. A lot of meteorologists now are big into coding and are writing their own programs so they can make their own maps.
Art, do you have time to answer 2 more quick questions?
Sure.
Okay. With most meteorologists having the same access to the same computer models, how do you work to differentiate yourself from other local TV stations?
You don't try to differentiate yourself. You just try to be right. I mean, everyone's goal is just to be accurate. No one's going out of their way to be wrong. No one wants to look like an idiot. So we're all looking at the same information, but we're just coming up with generally slightly different opinions. I mean, weather is an opinion based on the data you're looking at. It's just like predicting who's going to win a football game when they do, Sunday NFL countdown, and everyone's got a different opinion. Or if you're trying to pick a stock and which ones are going to do best this year. Everyone has the same data that they can look at, but they don't all agree as to what's going to happen, which is why sometimes snow maps look a little different and forecasts look a little different. Everyone just comes to a different conclusion.
Excellent. And our last question is, do you have a suggestion for our home weather station? They are a CORAHS member who's looking to upgrade their equipment.
Yeah, I think the gold standard is Davis Instruments. They always make great weather stations, have for years and years. You really can't go wrong. And there's kind of you run the gamut for different models, how much you want to spend, how many variables you want. You could get the a simple thing, or you could get something that's well over $1,000 and has all the bells and whistles. Also popular these days are weather flow stations. They've got a really nice interface, and I'm seeing more and more and more of those showing up, especially across Cape Cod. We're getting a lot of our wind data from weather flow stations now. So those are a couple of brands that you might want to look into.
Excellent. That was the last of our questions. And Eric, thank you so much for taking your time out of your very busy schedule to talk to us about your book and to answer our questions. It was greatly appreciated, very informative. And again, please, you can check out Eric's book from the Falmouth Public Library, and you can also purchase them at 8 Cousins.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and I hope you enjoy the book. It's not too heavy, it's not too cumbersome. It kind of gets into some of the science and then some of the people stories and how these storms kind of come together, but it's a good overview of some storms, and then you can always dig in deeper into some more, and maybe there'll be another volume because there's plenty of interesting weather events here in New England, and there's room for growth, no doubt about that.
Well, thank you so much, Eric, and we look forward to seeing you on the television and seeing what's coming next for us. So,
all right.
Thank you so much. Much appreciated. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you so much for coming.
Good night.